Market Journal, television for agricultural business decisions, is a presentation of the University of Nebraska-Lincoln's Institute of Agriculture and Natural Resources. Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine.
Hello everyone, I'm Troy Moling and thank you for joining us this week on Market Journal. Hope everyone had a wonderful 4th of July. Glad to be back with you again this week. And beginning the broadcast, we've been experiencing some hot weather and forecasters say that's likely to continue. Since we're at a time in the season that's critical for growing crops, the way the forecast shakes out is especially important for your bottom line. Nebraska Extension agricultural climatologist Al Dutcher joined me to explain what this weather market means.
Well, Troy, simply, weather market is simply the weather impacts during that critical pollination phase and the concern whether or not you're going to make your crop compared to what the projections were and what your carry out is, and trying to balance those things. So, this time of year, things can get really interesting, especially if you got some dryness issues around the United States.
And Al, over the past several weeks, much of Nebraska is experiencing above normal temperatures along with below normal rainfall. Break that down for us and explain what that means for crop conditions and pasture conditions in the coming weeks.
Well, I think the hardest hit is pastures, and certainly when you look at the 30-day temperature deviations across the country, you can see that most of the major warmth is exactly in the high plains region from North Dakota all the way southward. And in terms of precipitation, the last 60 days really shows where the pastures are hurting. Really dry in the western high plains region. Farther east you go, more concentrated areas of precipitation. So a little bit wetter east, much drier to the west.
With these above normal temperatures here in July, we're keeping an eye not only on corn pollination, but also heat stress in cattle, right?
Yeah, simply when you look at the CPC outlooks for July being hotter than normal, of course, that's always concerned about excessive heat because our normal highs are in the low 90s during much of July. So excessive heat puts you 10 degrees higher. Add in humidity, and then you start to get concerned with the cattle. Luckily, from a model standpoint, you see long expansive periods of extreme heat and extreme relative humidities. Get a few days of it, backs off, get a few more days of it. Hopefully that's the way it stays for the rest of the month, and we continue to get a chance of precipitation offset this dryness that has been fairly well established across much of our region for the better part of 60 days.
Take us through the drought monitor. What have we been seeing here?
What we have seen is an expansion slowly and progressively since this winter. The drought in the southern plains and the southern Rockies expanding toward the north has now reached Nebraska. We're seeing an expansion of dryness conditions in the southwest, northwest panhandle, and abnormally dry conditions starting to invade much of west central, and northeastern Nebraska, and probably into the southern panhandle. And I think the worst condition can be related to the 60-day precipitation and percent of normal. And that is the worst conditions, I think, for pastures of that area was 25 to 50% of normal invading southwest, southern panhandle, and northwest. There's where I think the conditions are really going to deteriorate over the next 2 weeks, especially if we don't get the precipitation that's really well needed in that region.
Could you give us any good news with the weather over the next several weeks?
I can't give you much good news on the heat. I think the best of the heat is it will go return to near normal to slightly below normal on a day or two as a low passes to the north of us through the upper atmosphere. More importantly, what I see as a possibility is that because we have so much high humidity in the atmosphere and corn giving off a lot of moisture during the pollination period, we get a little energy moving through, we can get scattered convection. Where it falls will be very localized and heavy, get 2-3 inches, maybe even more. Those around it get lost out. The price to pay for that is Iceman cometh and so does the wind. And at this time of the year, you always worry about green snap right coming into the pollination period. I think that's going to be our biggest issue is how many derecho events do we have over the next 2 weeks that move across the Corn Belt. It's those high wind events that can cause a lot of problems to the pollination period.
Al will be back later on in the show with his full forecast, so make sure you stick around for that. Next up, many factors, including weather, influence disease development in plants. The question isn't whether diseases will happen, but rather which ones and how severe will they be. Nebraska Extension plant pathologist Tamra Jackson-Ziems gives us a rundown of what she's seeing this year.
This year already in July, we're beginning to see a few diseases in spite of the drought conditions in some parts of the state. And it's a good reminder that high humidity is often a good driver for a few of these diseases. And so let's talk about what some of those are. As we're beginning to see corn in some parts of the state approach and begin to tassel, a lot of people are thinking about their foliar fungicide applications. Right now, we are seeing a little bit of northern corn leaf blight development. And remember, those lesions are more cigar-shaped. They can be very large, but right now, as they're beginning, they're quite small, about an inch or two long and rounded on the ends. So several counties are picking that up. And we're beginning to see some gray leaf spot, too, the other fungal disease that's very, very common for Nebraska. At this point, nothing is at a level that requires treatment, but these are things for us to watch as we move forward. Treatment decisions should be based on scouting, weather forecast, and whether that's favorable for disease, as well as disease history in those fields and what you know genetically about the hybrids or the soybean varieties in your field. So keep that in mind. And we do get better results from fungicides that have multiple modes of action. One good reason for that is for the disease frog eye leaf spot in soybean. That is a disease where we have now confirmed strobilurin or group 11 fungicide resistance in Nebraska. In fact, in all 10 counties that we sampled in 2019. If you think you have frog eye leaf spot and you're considering a treatment for it, fungicides do the best job between R3 and R5, so we've got a little bit of time in most fields. It's important to know, though, that if you have strobilurin resistance, and there's a good chance of that those products will not help you manage that disease. And so you're going to want to consider the other 2 fungicide active ingredients or classes that we do have available to us, ones that are from the triazoles and from SDHIs, or products that have all 3. And keep that in mind when you make these treatment decisions. Bacterial leaf streak is developing in numerous parts of the state this year in our cornfields, and we've seen this disease for several years now. The way you're going to tell that apart from gray leaf spot is that when you hold these leaves up to the light, the lesions can look very yellow and bright, and that's because the bacterium causing it produces a yellow pigment. Being bacterial, a fungicide will not stop that disease, so it's very critical that you get it identified correctly. When you're considering a fungicide application on corn, remember that we've had our most frequent returns when fungicides were applied at VT, that's full tassel emergence, or shortly thereafter. In fact, studies from across 13 states show us that there's an 80% chance of increasing yield, but you don't always get an economic return. That economic return will be determined by how much disease is there, which corn hybrids you're applying to, the disease history in those fields, and of course your scouting and how much disease you find out there. And so be sure and consider that. And if you are making applications, which most fields do not need a fungicide application at this time, just remember that more modes of action in the products will give you a better return in the end.
If you need help identifying or treating diseases in your fields, contact your local extension office for more information. Time for markets now, and this week I was joined by Frayne Olson, ag economist from North Dakota State University. We discussed the corn, soybean, and wheat markets, but I began the interview by getting a sense of how the COVID-19 pandemic is impacting farmers there in North Dakota.
Our impacts haven't probably been as large as what you've seen in Nebraska. We do have a relatively large livestock sector, but it's primarily cow-calf operations. We don't have the feedlot infrastructure that you do in Nebraska. So our impacts probably haven't been as great. The other thing is we have a very diversified crops agriculture. So we do deal with some specialty crops that you guys don't have to worry about. Now on the energy side, that's a completely different scenario or situation. So we've had much larger losses in our energy sector. The Bakken area, which is the shale oil production zone, has really been impacted. Crude oil prices have dropped significantly. We just recently got an announcement that the Dakota Access Pipeline was going to be shut down. There was a state court order indicating that the Corps of Engineers had not done their due diligence when it came to an environmental assessment. So we're going to be looking at some lower gas prices out of the Bakken just because we're relying on that pipeline to try and remain competitive. So from our energy sector, there's going to be some pretty large impacts. From the grain and livestock standpoint, again, livestock will likely be impacted more if we start seeing more additional shutdowns. You know, restaurant trade was starting to come back. Again, from the meat sector, that's important because we do sell and push a lot of our meat products through the restaurant trade. For drive-through business, that's a little bit different. I mean, a lot of the drive-through restaurants haven't seen the drop-off in production or drop-off in business. And again, but from a beef standpoint, you know, that's a lot of hamburger meat, not necessarily steaks. So again, we're watching what's going on. It's a moving target. The entire agricultural system is trying to monitor what's going on and adjust as quickly as possible.
And real quick, as far as the growing season up there, aside from COVID, how's everything going this year? I know that last season is one that a lot of North Dakota farmers just want to forget.
Yeah, 2019 was a really rough one for us. 2020 is really, you could, kind of the tale of two cities. You could almost divide the state right down the middle, and we've got opposite things going on in the state. So if you go east versus west, in the western part of the state, we came into the spring's work a bit dry. Planting was pretty much on time in the western portion of the state. But as we've moved through the growing season now, that's been a very, very dry area. If you look at the Drought Monitor Index, western North Dakota is now in a D1. There's places that are looking at a D2 that are starting to appear. Now this last week, fortunately, we did have some rain showers come through that helped recharge some of the surface moisture, which again will revitalize some of the primarily spring wheat, but also some of the corn and soybeans in the western regions. In the east was the exact opposite. We had a very wet fall. We had a lot of trouble getting the corn crop off. There was a lot of harvesting going on for the corn crop this spring. We're going to have some additional prevent plant acres, primarily in the east, again impacting our corn and soybean plantings primarily. There were some wheat, prevent plant wheat that showed up, but not as much as there was for prevent plant corn and soybeans. So eastern portion of the state has been very, very wet. We got in spring's work a little bit later than we'd like. The crop is hanging in there. The heat that we've had the last week or so has really helped kind of perk the corn and beans up. But we need to have these continued warm weather throughout the rest of the growing season to make sure we don't run into the challenges we saw last year.
Sure. And okay, advice on what we should be doing right now when it comes to sales of corn and soybeans. The market isn't falling apart like it was in April and May. Are you making any sales of that old crop for both of those?
Yeah, and I'd like to try and separate again old crop from new crop. Let's start with soybeans. For old crop soybeans, I do think these are some really good pricing opportunities. For the guys that are holding some soybeans and looking to try and get rid of them, I think that now would be a really good opportunity to do that. We've had a nice rebound on the soybean side. I think this is some really good opportunities for old crop. For new crop soybeans, to start making some sales at these levels are not a bad idea. Again, when we look forward in time, we do have some downside risk in the soybean sector. There's some uncertainty about what the Chinese demand is going to be as we move into the fall and winter months. So we have to be a little bit careful about some downside risk in soybeans. For corn, I do think there's some opportunities for getting rid of some old crop corn. For new crop corn, I'd be a little bit cautious yet. I think I'd wait to see how this warm weather and what the pollination is going to look like for the crop as we move into the August time frame. But again, I wouldn't hesitate if we get kind of a rally going on, if there's get to be some spark in the market, boy, take advantage of that, because right now the yield opportunities or the yield projections for the corn crop still look pretty good. Even though it's starting to build some heat and worries about a high pressure system building in the Corn Belt, there's relatively good soil moisture in most of the growing regions. I think the yield potential is still there.
And we got to get an update on wheat from you as well. Acres lower than in past years, but how are we looking in terms of yield and quality for that crop?
Yeah, again, the winter wheat harvest is going on right now. There's a lot of variability in yields, depending upon where you are. If you had some frost damage, or again, there were some dry areas showing up in the central part of the winter wheat growing, hard red winter wheat growing regions. But the quality looks very good. From what I'm understanding, the test weights are coming in very strong. Protein levels are a little bit lower than average, but not horrible. Again, a lot of variability. When we look at the winter wheat growing region in Montana, that's going to have a pretty good crop. As we move to the spring wheat growing region, again, we're going to see some variability. The western regions of North Dakota, where we tend to see a lot of wheat acres planted, and as it drifts then north into Saskatchewan, they had a drier spring. We're under some stress right now. The recent rains will certainly help. So I think the yield potential may be capped a bit because of the early development, but again, the rains we got recently should help the heads fill. I don't think we've had a lot of yield drag as of today. Again, we'll wait to see as once the combines start running, but I don't expect a major quality problems for the spring wheat crop either. So again, we may have taken the top end off the spring wheat yield potential, but I do think the quality will hold up.
Next week, we'll be joined by Mike Briggs over at Briggs Feed Yard for a look at the cattle markets. If you have a question you'd like for me to ask him, email us or get in touch on social media, and I'll pass your question along. Time now for weather with Nebraska Extension Ag Climatologist and Market Journal Chief Meteorologist Al Dutcher. And Al, you gave us a glimpse into our forecast earlier on in the show, but let's get a full breakdown from you right now.
Well, weather this week, we also seen some severe weather. Price comes with with precipitation. Unfortunately, we had a very wicked outbreak Wednesday night into Thursday morning. Over 93 wind reports for that event. 4 of them exceeded 75 miles an hour. Another 10 exceeded 70 miles per hour. I'm expecting that we will see some damage assessments coming out with some green snap and down corn. And of course, we've seen the severe weather again as we went into last night into this morning. So very active weather, and we've got a fairly active pattern coming up with the potential for more of these type of storms. So let's get right to the models. As you can see from this morning's upper air pattern, we have that high pressure ridge of the southwest of southern plains with a trough once again in the Pacific Northwest. Energy riding around the front range or front side of that ridge is what's responsible for the thunderstorm activity. We got high pressure building in, and that departing low that are responsible for the severe weather starting to move over toward Michigan. We'll see the severe weather come to an end, and fairly nice day for the remainder of the day. The ridge tries to break down a little bit tomorrow, and there is a little piece of energy that looks like it's going to move around the periphery of that ridge, low pressure at the surface development in southwestern portions of South Dakota. As it shifts toward the southeast, might touch off an isolated thunderstorm across portions of western and southwestern Nebraska. We see that ridge to the south, and we see some cooler weather try to move into the central and northern plains. Low pressure starts to develop, like the surface in southeastern Wyoming. Most of the major convection will be toward north, but we can't rule out some thunderstorm activity, particularly across the northern part of the state. And particularly as we go to Monday night into Tuesday morning, as we get a piece of energy moving around northern Nebraska toward the Great Lakes, as high pressure systems tries to push in, we'll start to see some convection along that frontal boundary, but not widespread at this point in time. By Wednesday, we kind of see that we get a slight northwest flow, another piece of energy moving through the central Rockies. Will try to make its way into the central plains as high pressure brings moisture in from the south on the backside of it. And you can see that they are advertising with that cooler air, potential for a severe line to develop from Michigan all the way back through Nebraska. On Thursday now, we start to see the ridge start to re-expand toward the southern plains, starts to bring some moisture in from the southern and southwestern United States. Low pressure develops in the northwestern panhandle. We may see some isolated thunderstorm activity, kind of some monsoonal type season. By the time we get to Friday, we see that ridge re-expanding and starting to build toward the north. Much warmer temperatures once again return toward the end of next week as we go back to above normal temperature levels. Low pressure tries to develop in the western portions of South Dakota. Most of the moisture convergence will be to the east-northeast of there, but we see some moisture starting to come into the desert southwest, and that may play a factor in western Nebraska as we go farther in time. As we look at the 8 to 14-day forecast from next Thursday through the following Tuesday, we see that he's starting to expand toward the Great Lakes, but in regards to precipitation, we see precipitation to the north and a very dry trend to our south, but there's increasing signs that as we get past this period, we'll start to see the backside of this ridge come in and more precipitation for the western high plains. So Troy, overall, we're looking at a little cooler temperatures working in early next week, return to warmth, and possibly some active weather as we get into the midweek period. So overall, not a bad forecast, but heat returns in earnest as we get late in the month.
Thanks, Al. Finally today, for crop producers, the time to be vigilant is now. The recent emergence of the Japanese beetle and grasshoppers will prompt many to aggressively scout their fields and determine what treatment, if any, is necessary. Market Journal's Bill Dodd spoke with Extension Educator Bob Wright to get his advice on scouting and treating these potentially destructive pests.
As crops begin to mature, familiar foes begin to emerge. While the Japanese beetle was first identified in counties along the eastern portions of Nebraska, the species has increased its distribution throughout the state, being identified as far west as Scottsbluff County last year. While the spread is far-reaching, it doesn't mean every field has been infested. However, for those that have, there are some factors to take into consideration.
Well, sometimes they start off on field borders, and so that may be where you'll see them first. In corn, they'll feed on the leaves, but once, and that's not an economic problem, leaf feeding, but once the ears emerge and silks emerge, that's where the Japanese beetles will prefer to feed. And they're rather large beetles, and you can get 4 or 5 beetles on an ear, and that can totally consume all the silks, and so that can interfere with pollination. The problem is typically we don't have uniform infestations across a field. As I said, oftentimes they're more common on the field borders. So it's a real judgment call whether to treat the whole field when you're only having damage on the field border. On soybeans, they feed on the leaves. They tend to feed on the upper part of the canopy, so the damage is very visible. But we have other insects that are feeding on leaves in soybeans at this time also. So we want to take into account all the leaf injury, and we have thresholds in vegetative stage soybeans. If 30% of the whole leaf area of the plant is lost from insect feeding, that's a treatable level. And we are starting to get into reproductive soybeans in some areas, and the threshold drops down to 20% on reproductive stage soybeans.
One thing to keep in mind while scouting your field, there is another less concerning pest that can be misidentified as the Japanese beetle, which is the sandchafer. The similarities in these two arthropods are striking. However, there are key differences to correctly identify each pest.
Big difference is the sandchafer doesn't feed much as an adult beetle, whereas the Japanese beetle does feed a lot. So the sandchafer is not an economic pest in the adult stage. It's about the same size as the Japanese beetle. It can vary a lot from light tan to almost dark black, the sandchafer. Japanese beetles have a metallic green head and thorax, and then they also have white tufts of hair down the side of the abdomen that the sandchafer doesn't have. So if you know what you're looking for, there's some differences.
Timing will always be a key factor when treating your fields for pests, and the Japanese beetle is no exception. Adult emergence will be underway for the next couple of weeks, and it's very important not to jump the gun and treat too early, as another wave of adults could return.
New adults are going to be emerging for about a 3-week period, and so if you spray too early, you may have new adults coming in later. There's a variety of different insecticides that are effective against Japanese beetles. The issue, as I said, is sometimes they move from field to field and we have new beetles emerge. And so you need to continue to monitor fields. There are a variety of pyrethroid and organophosphate insecticides that are active against Japanese beetles. I guess the other thing in soybeans, you probably also want to be aware of what other insects are present in terms of insecticide selection as well.
And speaking of being aware of what other insects may be present, immature grasshoppers have recently been reported in areas around crop fields in multiple locations around Nebraska. While there are a number of species in Nebraska, there are only 4 that should be of concern to crop producers. Those are the 2-striped, red-legged, differential, and migratory grasshoppers. There is an urgency involved in scouting out and treating these species before an infestation occurs in your fields, as populations are much easier to control around the borders during the immature stages of development.
But if you have more than 40 grasshoppers per square yard in a field border, that would be a threshold that you want to be worried about. The other thing to think about is in some areas depending on how much rain we've had this year, the grasshoppers will stay in the field borders until they start drying out or unless you mow them. So in some areas where we don't have as much, the field borders maybe are drying out, grasshoppers may move into the fields more quickly, or if you mow, they'll move into the fields more quickly. So those are things to think about. In terms of control measures, you need to choose something that's registered for the site you're treating. If you're just treating the field borders and not the crops, there's a wider variety of insecticides you can use. If you are both treating the field borders and the crop, you need to choose an insecticide that's labeled for both of those sites. And there's several different pyrethroids that can be used that have both labels for use on field borders as well as crops. A couple of trade names are Mustang, Warrior, and Asana. They're not labeled on all sites, so you need to check the label to be sure.
All in all, now is the time to be vigilant in the fields and begin thinking of a strategy to effectively treat and prevent any collateral damage these pests may cause. Reporting for Market Journal, I'm Bill Dodd.
Thanks, Bill. If you'd like more information on this topic, we've included a couple links on the Market Journal website. That's going to do it for this week's show. If you missed a story, be sure to download the Market Journal mobile app or follow us on social media to join in on the conversation. And don't forget, you can get the latest updates on the coronavirus outbreak at covid19.unl.edu. Hope to see you right back here next time. I'm Troy Moling. Thanks for watching.
Join Market Journal online at marketjournal.unl.edu. You can also follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine. Market Journal is produced by the University of Nebraska-Lincoln's Institute of Agriculture and Natural Resources.